Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar. I'm Jason Bordoff, Professor of Practice at Columbia School of International Public Affairs. I direct the Center on Global Energy Policy here at Columbia. And today we're going to discuss a new book, Making Climate Policy Work, by Drs. Danny Cullenward and David Victor, that addresses the use of market-based policies to address the climate crisis. So let me quickly say that this event's being webcast live. The full video will be available online in the coming days. For those joining us via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And for those watching the live stream anywhere else, you can submit these questions on Twitter using the hashtag CGEP Live. And our Twitter handle is @ColumbiaUEnergy. I'm pleased to introduce today's panelists, whom I know well. Dr. Danny Cullenward is the Policy Director at CarbonPlan, a lecturer at Stanford Law School, and the California Senate's appointee on the Independent Emissions Market Advisory Committee, charged with reviewing California's cap and trade program relevant to the topic of this book. And Dr. David Victor is Professor of International Relations at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at University of California, San Diego. He is co-director of the Laboratory on International Law and Regulation, and his research focuses on highly regulated industries and how regulation affects the operation of major energy markets at home and abroad. After we hear them describe what the book is all about, we'll have two people commenting on it, and then we'll have a conversation. Dr. Jessica Green will be the first. She is the Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto, cross-appointed in the School of Environment, and has previously held positions at Case Western University and NYU here in my hometown of New York City. Her research focuses on transnational private regulation and its interactions with public forms of authority. She is interested in ways that global institutions, both public and private, provide environmental public goods, and her book, Rethinking Private Authority, Agents and Entrepreneurs in Global Environmental Governance, was published by Princeton University Press in 2014. And then my colleague, Dr. Noah Kaufman, is a research scholar here at the Center on Global Energy Policy. He's an economist, leads research focused on climate change policy, teaches a course on energy decarbonization. And in the Obama administration, Noah served as the Deputy Associate Director of Energy and Climate Change at the White House Council on Environmental Quality, where I worked in the first term of the Obama administration. Thank you all for being with us. It really is a fascinating book and a very timely one. This conversation about the use of market-based instruments and carbon prices is very much a topic of conversation, not just in the US, but many other countries around the world. And we see different countries taking different approaches clearly to climate policy around the world. And this conversation about the role of carbon pricing as a tool, whether it's a primary tool, whether it's a secondary tool, whether it shouldn't be a tool at all to move to much faster decarbonization, has certainly not just been a topic of immense focus here in the US, but one that's been changing quite quickly. I think the way that tool is viewed in different circles. So thanks so much, Danny and David, for being with us to share your thoughts about it in this new book. And let me turn it over to you for a presentation.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Jason. Really a pleasure to be with you. Thanks to your center at Columbia for the invitation to talk about this book. The US release is this week on Friday, formally on Amazon. I think it's already available on Kindle. And the set piece for the book that we're talking about today is there's now a huge amount of ambition in the world around climate change, and not enough, but it's really an extraordinary picture. When the Biden administration takes over fully and sets their goals in place, something like 2/3 of global emissions are going to be subjected to net zero pledges, and a lot of real policy on the ground level, also actions by companies and a variety of other things. So that's the set piece for this book. And if we go to the next slide, all that activity and discussion is correlated with a big shift towards the use of market instruments, cap and trade systems, carbon tax systems. These are some data from the World Bank showing over time the number of initiatives and then the fraction of global emissions in the vertical axis, fraction of global emissions covered by different kinds of carbon pricing systems, both cap and trade and carbon taxes. Sharp uptick in the 2000s, another sharp uptick uptick now, something like 61 initiatives being tracked around carbon pricing. And so it looks like the world is not only doing more on climate change, but also turning to market instruments to actually get the job done. So that correlation is there, but correlation, as we all know, is not causation. And I guess spoiler alert to kids under the age of 8.4, the average age of kids not believing in Santa, that the market instruments are not the Santa for real action on climate change. And that's the puzzle we're trying to explain in this book, which is why do we see so much ambition, but we're actually not seeing most of the work being done by market instruments is being done by other kinds of policy instruments that then interact nicely or not so nicely with market-based instruments. And one way to look at that is to look at the prices that you actually see in these different carbon systems, which is shown on this slide here. This is a study originally done by Jesse Jenkins for the Kleinman Center at Pennsylvania. We've updated the data with new World Bank figures. And what we do here is we look at the fraction of global emissions shown on the horizontal axis as a function of the price level. So something like 86% of world emissions have zero price. Starting to see more cap and trade systems in particular coming in, but with very, very low prices. A small fraction have price levels that kind of bounce around $15 or less, California levels. A similar fraction is at European levels, kind of in 20s, 30s, and so on. Then you've got a tiny fraction, mainly in Sweden, Norway, Switzerland, a couple of other places that have very, very high carbon taxes, at least relatively speaking. You always see the Norwegians in particular out there doing good things for the planet. So the world is better for Norway because it has Norway. But in terms of total global emissions, the price levels there are are quite rare in terms of the overall total. And so this is the puzzle we're working through in the book, which is why do we see low prices for the most part, even despite higher ambition. And in a little bit, Danny will show you some data from California, for example, where we see literally a factor of 10 or more difference between the work being done by the cap and trade system and the actual work being done by California policies. What's new about this book is that we are offering a theory rooted in politics to explain the patterns systematically. And the core argument is that politicians were not asleep during Economics 101. They were wide awake. They heard what we all tell them about the transparency and fungibility and the beauty of market-based instruments in theory, and they were horrified by that. Precisely because transparency and fungibility that we like as theorists so much about market-based instruments, those attributes are politically very, very difficult in a world where where a key part of politics and staying elected involves channeling the costs and benefits of policies away from groups that are highly organized and opposed and into groups that aren't. And that's the essence of a lot of the political behavior. And that's what we're trying to explain systematically in this book. What's new about the book is the theory of politics that applies to the real world experience with cap and trade and carbon tax systems. And what's also new is it's very data rich, intense analysis of the actual experience. And what we're going to do, Danny and I are going to do over the next 15 minutes or so, is give you a window into some of the arguments we're making in the book by answering 3 questions. And the first question that I'm going to talk about, which is why are carbon prices low even when ambition is so high? And the answer to this is it varies a lot by sector. And the politics are different in different sectors. And one way to think about this is to look at the difference between the price of carbon, that's the nominal price inside different economies. So if you go to the carbon tax law and you look at what's the price that's listed there, or you go to the cap and trade system and say, at what price are permits trading, that's what we show here on the 45-degree diagonal axis on this chart here. This is a really interesting data set Jeffrey Dolphin, or then at Cambridge University, now at Resources for the Future, put together, which looks at the posted price, the nominal price of carbon in all the major markets, and then also looks at the economy-wide average price, which you get by looking at the price that really applies sector by sector. What you see is the economy-wide average price is roughly half the level of the nominal price. And that's because different sectors are treated differently. We tend, when we think about the theory of market-based instruments, we tend to focus a lot on administrative feasibility as the explanation for that, and that plays a role, there's no question about it. But in our book, what we emphasize is the role of politics, that the politics are different in different sectors. And so some sectors, frankly, can tolerate higher prices because political opposition to that is lower, or the capacity of government to compensate the key politically organized actors in that sector, that capacity is greater. And to kind of summarize the argument that we're making in the book, you see that is on the next slide. So in this slide, what we're showing you here is on the vertical axis is the demand for policy response, which is in effect the extent to which voters and other politically important groups are aware of the extra costs being created by cap and trade systems and carbon tax systems. That's the vertical axis. And the horizontal axis is the extent to which policymakers have tools available, a toolkit if you like, tools available to compensate those organized groups, to keep them whole, or to compensate them in some other way so that they become less opposed to the highly visible costs of the market-based instrument. Transportation fuels are very interesting because voters almost everywhere in the world are extremely sensitive to the costs of policy interventions with regard to transportation fuels. You see this in the Yellow Vest movement. You see this in California, where despite having some of the most aggressive climate policies in the world, voters are super sensitive to the posted price of gasoline at the pump. You see this all around the world in different ways. And also, frankly, policymakers have relatively limited toolkit to compensate users of transportation fuels for that. Whereas the opposite is true more or less in the electric power business. It's not that people don't care what their electric rates are if there are carbon prices applied to utilities, but that policymakers through regulation, tariff control, and so on have a lot of mechanisms available to in effect compensate and adjust the way those tariffs flow through to politically well-organized groups. And what we do in the book is we explain how these variations in the structure of the politics explain what you observe in the real world, which is that cap and trade systems, for example, tend to apply exclusively or principally to the electric power sector and a few other sectors, in part because those costs can be compensated. Whereas as soon as you take a cap and trade system and you link it to the transportation sector, as we did in California, then the politics there become much, much harder. And so ironically, the whole system becomes anchored to the lowest common denominator of what is politically feasible. And one of the pieces of policy advice we have coming out of this is that the standard wisdom in how you design a good market is you link together as many sectors as possible so that in effect capital and effort is fungible across different sectors. We argue for the exact opposite, that you want to have differential sectors and differential strategies, sector-based strategies, if you like, in part because the politics are so different in different sectors. And you want to be super careful about linking together sectors that have a high capacity to politically absorb high prices like electric utility service with those like in transportation fuels where the political capacity is much lower, because you then in effect hook the whole system to a sea anchor that makes it hard to make progress. And that unfortunately is where we are in California today. Next slide. Last slide I want to show you before I hand it over to Danny is that one of the implications of this argument we're making is that this helps explain why you see this huge variation in prices across different cap and trade systems. These are data shown over time, current to the present day. Different cap and trade systems with different price mechanisms. Theorists look at this and see an opportunity for trade, international trade. We look at it as political economists, we look at it and see it as a warning sign that the politics are different in different sectors, and if you were to try to link them together, that those efforts would fail. And because the politics are different in different sectors, these cap and trade systems in particular are designed to trade the residual. So put differently, regulatory instruments, industrial policy instruments do most of the work for controlling emissions, and then the cap and trade system, because it's a quantity measure, trades whatever is left over. And that trade leftover, or the residual trading process, explains a lot of the volatility you see in these systems. It also explains why prices are low, because policymakers are using regulatory instruments to do most of the work, and they're using cap and trade systems to almost create a fig leaf that they're using a market instrument with low costs. Everyone should be thrilled about that, when in reality the costs are higher. We call this in the book Potemkin markets, after those old fabled czarist villages, where you take the czar, czarina to a village, you say, look at what a great job we're doing here. But if you look behind the facade, what you see is there's nothing there. And the same is true here, that the cap and trade systems in particular are a facade behind which the real work that's being done is regulatory in nature and not market-based in nature. So let me hand it over to Danny, who's going to talk about the second and the third questions that we try and answer in the book.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Jason, Noah, and Jess, for being with us and for the opportunity to share this work. I want to talk about two implications, just a subset of the things we talk about in the book that follow from this core model of Potemkin markets, where we see, again, the markets look more important than perhaps they are, and these political barriers lead them to play these secondary roles supporting these other kinds of regulatory and industrial policy instruments. And the first question I want to ask is, where does all the money go? And this is, I think, probably the most important and understudied question in all of carbon pricing, because it's where, in my opinion, almost all of the politics actually form, but almost none of the analytical work is followed. And so what I want to show here is, as far as we can tell, the best and only and still significantly challenged data set on the global revenue use patterns across both carbon markets or cap and trade programs and carbon taxes around the world. And it's a phenomenal data set published under cover of a World Bank technical report, but conducted by some economists at the Institute for Climate Economics in Paris. And it's phenomenal. No one's ever pulled this together with this similar kind of rigor since a much older study in 2012. And what you see here is a couple of really interesting patterns. There's a lot of noise in the way people talk about revenue use, and we think that noise can be collapsed into three different categories of the way revenues are spent. One is something we call green spending, highlighted here in the color green. And that's the notion that a lot of the monies collected by these programs are spent on things that, at least nominally, are encouraging or accelerating climate mitigation. So you make polluters pay through one of these carbon pricing programs, and you take the money and you spend it on clean energy or R&D or something that pushes the envelope of climate mitigation further. Another approach, which is very, very popular in conversations in North America, is revenue recycling. The idea that you take those revenues and you reduce taxes on labor or capital, or maybe you give direct lump sum transfers to people living in your jurisdiction. Interestingly, we see that a little bit in the tax systems, but almost never in the cap and trade programs. It is one of the few compensatory tools that's available when things happen to, for example, the transportation sector. And we may come back to this in Q&A, but the big Canadian proposal to move to very ambitious carbon prices is going to rely heavily on this concept as a way of addressing the political opposition that might follow from visible price impacts. The third category of spending is going into the general fund. So just directing those carbon revenues into the treasury system of the government like any other tax system. And we see that is much more common in carbon tax systems. I think the big pattern to show here is that when it comes to cap and trade programs in particular, the system is dominated by these green spending efforts. But there's been almost no oversight either within or across jurisdictions as to how effectively the money is being spent, as well as to what it's actually going to, because as everyone familiar with the climate problem knows, it's so big it touches everything, which means it's pretty easy to label anything a climate measure if you want. And this is, we think, one of the most important areas to think about, because a lot of the politics are around revenue allocation. And in the cap and trade and carbon tax programs, that's an extraordinarily important part of addressing the barriers to higher carbon pricing ambitions. And a lot of the sort of suggestions that are out there in the literature is that regulatory strategies and carbon pricing strategies will go together, there'll be synergies, and over time, both will get stronger. To the extent that's going to be true, where the success in carbon pricing unlocks these positive political feedbacks, our view is a lot of that's going to happen through the spending side of these programs. And that's one of the reasons we think that paying very close attention to how these revenues are being used is going to be an important thing both for analysts to understand and for practical people who are trying to push these systems forward to better design public policy instruments to funnel these efforts towards meaningful outcomes. In no way is this amount of global revenue, it's on the order of something like $45 billion a year as of 2018, in no way is that big enough to solve the climate problem. But if it's directed effectively towards some of the most high impact things we can think about, some of the most precious and most difficult public goods, that's a huge dent you can make in a problem. And right now we think not a lot of that is being channeled as effectively as it might be. The second pattern I want to talk about when it comes to these green spending systems is the tendency for these systems to become what we call green pork. It's very easy to label something green, And it's very easy for that definition to get slippery. And this figure here attempts to show in a single slide this phenomenon of Potemkin markets that David described, where the official explicit carbon price is a fraction of the real effort that's being applied, and to compare that to some of the spending instruments, all within the jurisdiction of California, which has perhaps the richest public data on these systems. On the left-hand side of the figure, I'm showing the explicit cap and trade price, which has hovered generally between $10 and $18 a ton. An estimate from our nonpartisan legislative analyst office puts the cost of our renewable portfolio standard, which is quite aggressive in electricity, at $60 to $70 a ton. And we have a low carbon fuel standard for transportation fuels that trades around $200 a ton these days. All of these measures are included in the state's most recent comprehensive climate policy strategy called the Scoping Plan, which finds a range of policy costs needed to get to our ambitious 2030 target of something on the order of negative prices up to $200 a ton. So you can see the cap and trade program is, effectively an order of magnitude smaller than some of our more expensive and most ambitious policies. I'll note for the economists who want to talk about this in more detail, we have both higher ambition and potentially less economic efficiency as we mix in these different instruments, but there's no question a big part of what we're seeing is a difference in ambition. When you look at the spending side of the program, things get even crazier. The average cost effectiveness of the spending side of the cap and trade program clocks in at nearly $500 a ton. And if you're spending these kinds of monies on high impact early stage R&D or innovative deployment of first of a kind facilities, that's almost exactly where a lot of people in the literature would say you need to target your efforts. But it's also very clear that that's not what's going on. And there's quite a bit that's been mixed into the system that has almost infinite costs because it produces very little in the way of climate gains, or it's been relabeled to have some sort of nominal climate impact. So again, the spending side of these programs we think is where a lot of the politics happen, but we really haven't connected the dots between that and the overall theory of how to get the ambition of these systems going faster and farther. The last question I want to answer is one that is near and dear to my heart, both because carbon offsets, the topic of this question, are at the heart of most of these programs, particularly cap and trade programs, but also because they're very much at the center of discussions around corporate neutrality and the government climate neutrality pledges. And the big question is, why do these credits always end up in such a bad way? And the answer we propose in the book is when you think about carbon offsets from the standpoint of these public policy systems, these mandatory cap and trade programs and carbon taxes, the demand for carbon offsets comes from the industries that are subject to the program and therefore face a high cost if the program is ambitious. What they want is quantity, and ideally what they want is low prices. So they want a lot of cheap offsets. Some of them might care a little about quality, some of them might not care at all. And the problem is we have an asymmetric balance where the complexity of creating high quality offsets programs is enormously difficult because an offset is a claim about emissions that occur outside of a regulated system and therefore outside of the core expertise of a regulator about something that wouldn't have happened. It turns on a counterfactual scenario that's never observed. And it's rarely a situation where we have large and sophisticated regulatory bodies with deep, financially disinterested expertise applied to these problems. More often than not, you end up with allied NGOs or other industry-affiliated private standard-setting bodies that come in and say, we can get the job done, we can get it done quickly. The opponents of offsets are typically those like environmental justice groups who aren't part of the overall coalition supporting carbon pricing problems. And in that environment, it's not a surprise that we end up with a race to the bottom on quality, on something that's almost impossible to measure. And I'll flag here, there was a great story, a really frankly depressing story in Bloomberg Green about the experience with forest carbon offsets, which are the dominant source of offset crediting in most programs. I'll flag here also the complexities of dealing with both avoided emissions versus carbon removal will need to move in this world to actual removal if we want to do net zero targets. And a lot of the efforts, including a prominent effort in the United Kingdom that's thinking about how to reform and scale these systems, basically nobody's dialoguing with the problem of quality. We think that problem is so tough in these public markets that it can't be solved, but potentially with the right efforts in private markets, there could be significant reforms. However, that requires, I think, a really sophisticated understanding of why the politics have screwed these programs up almost everywhere they've been tried at scale. And so far, we're not seeing a lot of attention paid to that question in private markets. So let me wrap up our presentation here and I look forward to the discussion that follows. I wanted to just highlight 5 major implications that flow from this political model we've developed. The first one is we think that carbon pricing has an important role to play, but it's largely in diffusing established technologies. And when it comes to bringing new technologies to market and developing both the science and engineering and the deployment and the early innovation and deployment stages, that's going to be a question more for industrial policy, we think. So we think the balance of the way folks are talking about this has been off for a long time and it needs to be readjusted. The second thing to mention is that when it comes to these interactions with regulations, David mentioned that cap and trade ends up trading the residual, and that's one of the reasons the carbon market programs get stuck in low gear. It's very difficult to reform them when you have regulations or macroeconomic conditions that depress market prices exogenously, and that's one of the reasons we think carbon taxes are strictly superior from a political economy view. They can be harder to implement, but once they're in place, they play much better with this overall system and provide better opportunities for scaling and growth. The third recommendation, I think, is something that, as David mentioned, it's kind of heretical from the standpoint of economic theory. The politics are easier when you go sector by sector, and that also means there's fewer potentials and fewer opportunities for achieving low-cost, sort of uniform carbon pricing signals across an economy. We think politically that's not a feasible way to think about serious systems and encourage people to take the opposite approach. It's really interesting when you think about the revenue side of these programs, because revenue is where all the action has been. Revenue is also one of the things you can do to mitigate the cost impacts. And again, I mentioned the Canadian example where the Canadian government is thinking about returning most of the revenue. If that's what you need to do to justify a high price, it's a very difficult and challenging thing to do. If it's done and done well, that's great. But for the vast majority of the systems, particularly those that aren't targeting transportation fuels, spending is where all the action is, both the potential for serious mitigation and the potential for politics that unlock higher prices. And we think that needs to be taken into account. The last thing to say is we think basically carbon offsets don't work in these systems because the people who want them don't want good offsets. And that's just a fundamental structural problem. You can deliver what offsets deliver through price controls by setting the prices explicitly, either through taxes or cap and trade market design features. And you can target the revenues that go to offset recipients through spending. There is, we think, no good cause to have offsets in these programs and some important implications for the private markets as we go. So I will stop there. And again, thank you all for the opportunity to share what we're doing.
If I could, I'm going to ask 1 or 2 follow-up questions before I go to you, if that's okay, Jessica.
Sure.
And I mean, I have a lot of questions, so I'm not going to ask them all now. But just one first, just on the last point you made, I'm curious if you accurately describe a lot of problems or potential problems and concerns with land-based solutions and with offsets. Question is whether that is a function of a flaw with a carbon pricing system. Most modeling, almost any modeling, shows that to come anywhere close to 1.5 degrees, we need significant amounts of negative emissions. Those can be technologically based or they can be nature-based solutions. Those are very hard with issues of credibility and integrity and monitoring and enforcement, as you described. I'm just wondering if carbon tax is one tool that in which those concerns could be raised. But if we don't use carbon pricing, we use something else, those problems are still going to be there if you want to use that as a tool to get negative emission reductions. So is that about a carbon tax, or is that just a problem with negative emissions that come from the nature sector?
So that's a great question. Thank you. And I want to be clear. I think we all understand in this conversation that getting to net zero is going to require a lot, and it's going to require everything, including the land sector. I think what we're trying to show in this book is the mechanism of using offsetting to do that, which is the principal way we've engaged that, is doomed to basically fail, at least in public policy systems. I'm not saying there isn't potential in the private sector to do better, but basically the standards right now are there are none. They're garbage. And understanding that, I think, requires a sense of the politics of where they come from and why. Reforming that, I think, is a much longer conversation. I'll just flag the argument we're making in terms of structural politics is the mechanism of offsetting using carbon credits based on counterfactual claims is one where you get a race to the bottom on quality. And other approaches, including public spending and regulation, may offer superior vehicles for targeting the important issues that need to be dealt with in those sectors. So this is not an argument against forests and thinking about forests as part of climate solutions, But I do think it's important to mention, when you look at the volume of credits traded in these systems, most people think forests are removing carbon, but almost all of the credits are claims being made against, I'm not going to cut down these trees. It's actually avoided emissions credits rather than carbon removal credits. When you get into the weeds of this stuff, a lot of the games follow from the games that can be played by saying, I was going to cut down the trees, but I swear I didn't, as a result of your payment. And that's the political model we think is going to cycle to the bottom. Whereas spending and some standards and some much more careful and serious thought into how to do this is, we think, a better way to go.
Let me just ask one more question, and then we'll go to Jessica and Noah. Just to sort of ask you to finish the presentation in the sense of what a better path is. So I understand the concerns you have with carbon tax, and a question would be whether these are issues of poor design and implementation, because in a sense, as you noted at the outset, we're falling short across the board, and so it is clear that when we try to put market-based mechanisms in place, issues of political compromise, and as you say, there are issues when you're trying to do it across sectors, a variety of reasons why these end up being weaker and less effective than one might hope. Is that not also the case for alternatives to market-based solutions, which are also not doing as much as one would hope in many cases? And when you use the phrase industrial policy, that could mean a lot of different things. What are you talking about?
Yeah, so good question. A third or a quarter of the book is about how to do better, what the better path looks like. You know, we're not trying to be the Grinch and put coal in everybody's stocking here, although there's a little bit of coal here and there. But the goal is to lay out what you could do that would be better. So there are two routes that need to be followed simultaneously. One is where we use market-based instruments. We need to make design the market-based instruments so they play better with regulatory instruments, and so that they generate more revenue that can be spent effectively. And so there's a whole chapter on making the argument, in effect, for transforming cap and trade systems into more tax-like mechanisms, or using tax-like mechanisms, and more basic, public finance oversight with regard to how the money gets spent. So that's one track. The other track is to get better at intervening directly in economies. So some people call it industrial policy, some people call it the Green New Deal, some people have other names for it and so on. Some people are horrified by all of this and want to run and hide. We make the argument in a big chapter in the book that you need to work sector by sector, especially where the frontier technologies are not available, where the market instruments on their own aren't going to produce the level of innovation. And that because the politics and the industrial organization vary by sector, it has to be organized sector by sector. And I think that logic, frankly, is playing out. You see that in the way the UK government is hosting COP26 with these big campaigns that they're focused on different sectors. And I think it's just one last comment on this. The concerns that people have about the capability of government to get involved in the economy are omnipresent, and they must be omnipresent. But I think what's really interesting, as someone who studies government and politics, is that the capability of government to intervene effectively in the economy has grown enormously. And you see that in ARPA-E, you see that in the loan program, you see this kind of across the board. And so we have to have a vision that's connected to reality and that relies in part on the state, but the state being smart and not just building white elephants in the desert.
Great, thanks. Well, I will come back to that because I'm interested also in kind of the thoughts on whether in sectoral approaches, you can put in place standards or other things that have flexibility that mimic something like carbon prices in different sectors. In a sense, that's what some versions of the Clean Power Plan sort of did in electricity. Jessica, let me turn to you, please. Thanks.
Okay, great, thanks. Thanks, Danny and David, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. And it's great to see the book in print and be able to talk about it with this great group of panelists. Danny and David and I are on the same page on a lot of things. So what I'd like to do is talk about what I think they get right and the key messages, and then what I think might be overlooked in their discussion and where they don't go far enough. So where we agree is that markets are political. They don't magically work. I haven't been saying this quite as long as David and Danny, but I've been saying it for a while. So markets require active management, which in turn requires political consensus. So we've relied too much on markets without taking this fact seriously. So and I won't rehearse all the weaknesses of the market approach that they've talked about, which I also agree with, but I want to underscore 2 points. One, which they didn't come out as in the presentation as much as in the book, is that market-based instruments are designed to have a limited impact. And so we can't put all our eggs in this basket, or maybe even a lot of eggs in this basket, because they just don't reduce tons as much as we would like. I just completed a meta review of articles that look at ex post analyses of carbon pricing, and I found that the vast majority of policies reduce emissions 1 to 2% per year. So this is just additional evidence to suggest that this is not the main course of carbon reductions, right? And often these are accompanied by big political battles, particularly in high emitting countries like the US, Canada, and Australia. And that's not something that we can overlook lightly. The second point is that linking markets can exacerbate lots of problems that individual markets face, right? There is an economic argument for efficiency, but as it follows the same logic as free trade, right? Is that the free flow of allowances is going to lead to efficiency improvements, but it's going to affect buyers in certain industries disproportionately. And that can lead to pushback, particularly when these industries are powerful or well organized. And so I think that's something that, really it's not only argument for dividing by sector, but keeping states and countries' markets unlinked, right? This was a big argument post Kyoto was, oh, well, we're going to do a backdoor around the gridlock and create this global market for carbon through linking carbon markets, and that's just not a good idea. I think they have the 2 most important recommendations they make are, if we have to have markets, which I think is an if, make them more like taxes, right? So again, the review that I just completed shows that even with this small amount of emissions that carbon pricing affects, that taxes are more effective at reducing emissions than ETSs. And interestingly, one correlation there is that taxes happen at the federal level, right, not at the subnational level, so that it shows that there's some more political consensus about what needs to be done. And the second is, and I've been banging on this drum for a while, get rid of offsets. In my book, I talk about the history of the creation of the voluntary carbon market, and all of the things that Danny and David say are absolutely correct. This is a really consequential point for 2 reasons. One, as the net zero pledges continue to roll in, offsets are not going anywhere. In fact, the demand for them is going up. And this is also true because of the CORSIA agreement, the aviation agreement, which basically relies on offsets to stabilize aviation emissions. So this is a really big issue that we need to deal with, and everyone is pushing in the same direction, which is we need to maintain offsets as a sort of backstop for the other measures that we're doing. So where do we disagree? Danny and David say we need to focus on climate change through industrial policy. Here, I agree, absolutely. And this, again, has a lot of different names, as David said. But I think they underestimate the role of obstructionism, right? So the model that they, in the solutions part of the book, they talk about experimentalist governance, right? This idea that various actors need to problem solve together to find the technological solutions to climate change, and that this can be catalyzed through a penalty default system, basically a system of incentives and sanctions that are provided by governments. I think this underestimates the willingness of a lot of groups to work together. So in work that I've done with Tom Hale and Jeff Colgan, we talk about a different model of climate politics, which we call existential politics. And we divide the world into 2 ideal typical groups: owners of climate forcing assets, like fossil fuel companies, utilities, mining companies, heavy industry, and those who own climate vulnerable assets that will become increasing, like the insurance industry, people who own property at low near sea level. And so ambitious climate policy is going to devalue or even destroy climate forcing assets, while climate change is going to devalue or even destroy climate vulnerable assets, right? And so as both the effects of climate change intensify and the efforts to address climate change intensify, we're going to see increasingly contentious battles between these two groups to maintain the value of their assets. That's the basic idea of the model, which we talk about in much more detail in the paper. But to me, until governments address these fundamental conflicts, experimentalist governance is going to be limited in its ambition and its impact. And the argument for experimentalist governance is, okay, well, we have this penalty default, this incentive or punishment that can persuade actors to work together. But in reality, the penalty default is where politics happens, right? Because that is shorthand for government intervention, which is precisely the thing that you're arguing for. So I think that we need to think more about, and the offsets I think are a nice example of how penalty defaults will be constrained by obstructionists, and particularly by those who have a large structural influence on politics. So I think that there various sectors can do more to overcome specific technological problems and implementation challenges, but only after these basic material conflicts are resolved. And so I think this is what requires existential politics rather than what I see to be a much more optimistic political economy model of experimentalist governance. So I know that I don't have a lot of time. I think I'll stop there, but thanks very much. This is a great book. It's going to be a classic for the ages. Thanks.
Thanks for those great comments. Just so I understand your comments, are you sort of saying your research suggests that the same political forces which weaken the effectiveness of how a carbon price ends up getting designed will then be true potentially for alternatives to a carbon price as well? It's not about the mechanism, it's just the political economy, climate policy.
Right. I think that, David and Danny and I agree that carbon pricing is subject to politics, and so are other approaches to addressing climate change. And so we just need to be, I really respect their pragmatism, as I've said to them privately a lot, but I think that it underestimates some of these profound kind of just material conflicts between different classes of asset owners.
Okay, I know Noah may raise a couple of other issues, so I don't know if David or Danny, you want to quickly just give a reaction to what Jessica said, and then I'll go to Noah.
I just want to give one quick reaction. First, appreciate the comments, and I want to focus on the area that you really drew a sharp line under where we disagree, and I guess we disagree in part. To me, what's been really striking is to watch how so many firms that you'd think would be opposed to climate action have actually changed their interests. And it's precisely because of what you call existential politics that, look at the oil and gas industry, for example, all the European headquartered firms are now saying, and to some degree doing, totally different things from 5 years ago, 10 years ago. A lot of what they're doing is going to fail. Some of it won't. Nobody really knows. And they face fear of, really ceasing to exist in some sense in their home market. And that's inspiring action, and we may like it or not like it and so on. We don't see the same on the US side because the threat to their existence is different. And so that's an example of a penalty default, a motivating force that then forces firms to typically work with government because they don't have the capacity to solve all the problems themselves. And a lot of these big investments are still really expensive. Look at, for example, what Equinor is doing with Northern Lights, big CCS project, where they have the highest carbon tax environment in the world, and they still can't justify the project without collaboration with government. And so that's the logic we're trying to lay out. Chuck Sable, just a little piece of advertising, Chuck Sable at Columbia Law School and I are finishing a book for next year on this subject, and the current issue of Boston Review excerpted from the book, and as a whole terrific conversation with a bunch of folks about this whole issue of when and how are the politics around obstructionism plastic.
Let me just briefly add, go ahead. Just briefly, thank you, Jess. Really appreciate it. And I think one of the things we need to do is start to formalize the way we think about this stuff. It's one of the things I appreciate about you is even where we disagree, it's very clear to understand why. And that's the conversation we think we need to have. So I'm not wedded to any particular worldview other than getting the data right. And I really appreciate the perspective you shared.
You're going to say something quickly, Jessica?
Yeah, just one quick comment. So I think in some ways you're right, but if you look at, other work that I've been doing with Pasha Madavi and Tom Hale and others looks at what the oil and gas majors are actually doing, right? And they say that they're doing all this stuff. And then when you look at how much they're actually investing in renewables and becoming a different kind of asset holder, the numbers are like laughably small. So, I think that the penalty default can drive that, but there's a question of the extent to which the penalty default is driven by capital or capital is driven by the penalty default. And I think that's a difficult political economy question to untangle. And also, I have a piece in that Boston Review book, so you'll see my opinion there.
Noah, you've been waiting patiently. So I know you've thought a lot about the role carbon pricing can play. I don't think it's a silver bullet. It plays a role, but it's not going to do everything. But I'm also going to ask you to sort of like channel all environmental economists, since you're kind of playing that role here in this discussion too. And so I want to hear your thoughts, and then also kind of what you think reactions more broadly might be to this argument from those who kind of have thought deeply that a carbon price might do a lot of the work for a long time.
Sure. Well, thanks, Jason. It's good to be with everyone here. I'm quite certain I don't have the authority to speak for all environmental economists. But yeah, I will say up first, I learned a lot from this book. So I wanted to start by congratulating Danny and David. Then, like any good self-interested economist, I wanted to quickly pivot to make this about me and my own research, because I think it does nicely complement one of the main messages of the book. Danny and David argue that politically, it will be very difficult to rely too heavily on carbon prices. My co-authors and I published a study a couple months ago on net zero consistent carbon prices. It's in Nature Climate Change, you should check it out. And the study showed that even if we only cared about first principles, it's not clear we need carbon prices to rise to the sky high levels that previous studies have pointed to. And that's largely because studies typically analyze carbon prices in a vacuum as the only climate policy, even though we all know that a price alone is not even close to sufficient. And instead, if we assume that a carbon price is just part of a much broader strategy, including industrial policies that will lower the costs of technologies over time, that lowers the carbon prices that we need to achieve our emissions goals. So in our study, which one study, take with a grain of salt, we show that for a 2050 net zero pathway in the United States, that might mean prices in the range of $50 a ton in 2025, $100 a ton in 2030, which isn't far from the ballpark we're starting to see in some instances. And that's good news, because it means that maybe there isn't actually as large of a gap as we thought between what economics tells us and what might be politically achievable. Another thing I wanted to mention was this book, I think, highlights the importance of net zero emissions targets, which has only very recently taken over in the climate policy world. Because it strikes me that a lot of the historical failures described in the book really stem from the ability to hide behind a lack of ambition. Things like emissions caps or offsets. When the goal is zero emissions, there's nowhere to hide because you have to be on a pathway to eliminating your emissions. So this new paradigm might be a good way to at least partially correct for some of these problems. But I think the flip side of the net zero paradigm is that it also means policymakers can't hide from any political constituencies. So when Danny and David say that we shouldn't regulate the transportation sector like the electricity sector because of the political challenges, I'd say that's appealing now, but there's an element of that strategy that's just kicking the can down the road if we're serious about getting to zero. And I think we just need to be clear-eyed about what a sector-by-sector strategy means for our ability to achieve, say, 2050 targets. The last point I wanted to make, and really the only part of the book I'd really push back on, and Danny and David know this, there's somewhat dogmatic statements in there about things that they say just will never happen in the future, that carbon prices will never have a large impact compared to other policies, that will never trade off weaker regulations for stronger carbon prices. And it's not that I think they're necessarily wrong. In fact, I like their policy proposals quite a bit. I just don't see evidence that's nearly strong enough to support the strength of these convictions. And therefore, I don't think we should be discouraging the pursuit of those outcomes, which how it came off to me in the book. It'd be one thing if we had examples of places that were on successful deep decarbonization pathways with their sectoral industrial policy approaches. Instead, when I look at the places that are best positioned for an energy transition, one of the only common denominators that I see are some form of carbon price. And they're just one tool in the toolkit. And yeah, as Jason said, these pricing policies are much too weak, but the same is true with the regulations there. And the same is true with our funding of innovation. The same is true for our ability to build critical infrastructure of virtually any kind. Policy ambition has just been low across the board. So while Danny and David are absolutely right about the history of carbon pricing, looking backwards, a lot of unprecedented things will need to happen if we're going to successfully achieve deep decarbonization going forwards. And maybe they're right that better carbon prices isn't going to be one of those unprecedented things. But I guess my own guess is that it will be true in some places, not in others, and it'll just depend very much on the specifics of the place and time. Maybe Canada will rely very heavily on carbon prices, as the government has just recently said it intends to do. And maybe California will continue to use it more as a complementary strategy. Regardless, I'll just conclude by saying that I think it's terrific that books like this one are studying the politics of climate policies, that we're not wedding ourselves to first best solutions. I also think if the last decade has taught us anything, it's that we should be humble about any predictions of what's going to be politically possible. And just to make sure that we've developed strategies that are robust to a future that will inevitably be very different from the one we're expecting. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Noah. Well, this is clearly going to be most interesting if I just get out of the way and let you all react to one another. But I would love to, Danny and David or Jessica, sort of hear reactions. I saw Jessica making facial expressions about Canada's role that I would be interested in actually hearing what she was thinking. To what Noah said generally, and particularly that point that like ambition has just been weak everywhere, I guess your response would be actually when you change how you're thinking about policy and you're looking sector by sector rather than economy wide or something that changes the political economy, which might allow for higher ambition. But I don't want to put words in your mouth. So David or Danny, maybe you want to react to what Noah said.
Maybe I'll start. I'm just going to say two things, then I'm sure Danny will want to come in here. So our goal is not to defend inaction or lack of ambition or to decry the lack of adequate effort. Our goal is to explain what we're observing in the real world and the policy instruments that could really make a difference. And frankly, the more one doesn't do that accurately, with humility and forecasting and so on, as Noah rightly says, the more one doesn't have a good theory about changing the world, the more you spend a lot of time and effort and other resources on policy strategies that don't work. And the reason for this book is to lay out a theory for why we've done a lot of that, frankly, not done well, and how we could do better and what that means. So I guess I'll say two things. First, I guess I see the data totally differently. This is an area of probably big disagreement. I'm not quite sure about the dogmatism, but I guess I see the data quite differently about the places that are using market instruments right now, along with other policies. You look at California, you look at Norway, you see the market instrument policies are literally 1/10 of the level of effort as measured by marginal cost. There's a very important comment in the chat about total ambition as ultimately volume, not just marginal cost, but there's a starting point for it. And so that's a pretty big deal. And the pattern is consistent over time and now increasingly consistent over space. So that tells me that's a lot of data points that line up with the theory that we're trying to lay out here, which is not designed to be dogmatic against market instruments, but to be like, to quote Jake Jacoby, horses for courses. The market instruments are really good at optimizing, helping firms optimize allocation of capital and frankly behavioral choices amongst known technologies. That's what you see in the cap and trade systems that work on power markets, for example, where you're comparing coal and gas literally on a minute by minute basis. Not so good in the other kind of more transformative areas. So that's the first point I make. The second point I'll make just very briefly about net zero. I think this is a really important comment that Noah's made about the potential value of net zero. And I guess what I would say is that in theory, it makes it hard for anybody to escape. Politicians can't, ignore some groups and so on, but we've seen a lot of data points that politicians have an infinite toolkit for ignoring or avoiding inconvenient things. And so I think the jury remains out on net zero. Net zero has focused a lot of action, and it's in some cases focusing real experimentation and effort, and that's fantastic where that's really happening. In a lot of places, it's also frankly creating stronger incentives to do more of the garbage stuff with offsets that Danny has so eloquently outlined. And you see that first and foremost right now, I'd say in Corsia that Jessica mentioned.
Let me just briefly add one quick comment, and no, I really do appreciate your feedback and the perspective you bring. I want to make this really plain and simple for folks, and I'll use California as an example. Because we have a multi-sector program that covers 75% of our emissions, including transportation fuels, if you want to tweak the carbon price by $2 a ton, the oil industry will run attack ads against anyone who wants to do that. You take on every single incumbent at the same time. Whereas if you have a regulation or a sector-specific market-based program, the negotiation goes sector by sector. And that is, we think, one of the few areas where I think, aside from maybe offsets, we have expressed a dogma. And that is that the politics will always be tougher the more sectors you include in a program, which is not to say that you don't want some of these programs or that they can't contribute. But that, I think, is an empirically testable proposition. It's also a fact on the ground, and any practical person working on these systems knows incredibly well when you include more stakeholders in the conversation, you have to deal with more stakeholder perspectives. And it means that the lowest common denominator politics prevail in most of the outcomes in those situations. That, again, is not an argument against using market-based programs when they're well designed, and it's not an argument against pursuing economic efficiency. It's just a political fact.
Jessica, I'd love to hear your reaction to all of this. And also, I know the comment I made was I noticed the reaction when Noah was referencing what Canada recently announced, which seems to rely fairly heavily on a cross-sectoral carbon price. And reading the footnotes, just to give Noah a shout out, sort of pointed out that it was trying to figure out what the right carbon price was, not from, say, the social cost of carbon, which they acknowledge a lot of literature who suggests underestimates the social damages, but saying, what do we need to achieve a certain emission reduction target? And let's back the carbon price out of that, referencing Noah's article. I'd love to hear your thoughts about what they're doing, and does that evidence on the other side that maybe carbon pricing can be ambitious, or other thoughts you have?
Yeah, well, I think I want to start by saying one thing about using every tool in the toolkit. And I think, we're all in agreement that, this is a dire situation and we need to move as quickly and as aggressively as possible. And that's an argument for every tool in the toolkit. But I think the argument that I've made, and I think maybe Danny and David would be in agreement, is that carbon pricing is not politically equal to the other tools in the toolkit. People get really mad about carbon pricing. And I think that's exactly what you see in Canada right now. So first of all, Canada has a terrible climate record. And all of a sudden, we were going to miss our Paris pledge by about 20%. And then Trudeau comes out with this announcement last week saying, there's a lot of other things in the proposal, in the legislation, including zero ZEVs and more infrastructure for methane capture and all these kinds of things. But of course, what everybody focused on was the carbon price, right? So, and then again, everybody gets very polarized about this is what we need, this is going to kill the economy, and a few things in between. So. I think that, if it could go to $170 a ton in 2030, yeah, that would probably be good. I'm not confident that that will happen, because we also said that we were going to increase our carbon price $10 a ton every year. And then last year, before the election, the environment minister said, well, we're going to reevaluate this and let's see what happens. And by the way, if a carbon price is supposed to set, supposed to provide incentives for companies to make long-term capital investments, and those prices change with the political winds, then you're sending mixed messages, which doesn't achieve the economic goals that it wants. So I think, and the other thing to say about the carbon price in Canada is that, of course, there are 3 provinces that are now trying to get this overturned in the Supreme Court. They're challenging this in court, saying this is unconstitutional and you can't tax us. So this whole proposal rests on the successful decision by the Supreme Court upholding the government's right to tax. Now, I'm American, so and I'm certainly not a Canadian constitutional lawyer, so I can't assess the odds of that claim. But I think it shows the fragility, the political fragility of this proposal, and a lot of people are hanging a lot on this in terms of us achieving our Paris Pledge, but there are a lot of things that have to go right and fall in place in order for that to happen. And by the way, the final thing is that there's no mention in that proposal about what we're going to do about the tar sands, which is not only a huge source of emissions, but is becoming an increasingly risky asset, right? Total wrote down like $20 billion or something like that, million, I think, last year, because they think that this is not a feasible investment anymore. And so, this again speaks to the sectoral approach that we need to think about, well, what are we going to do about the oil and gas industry in Alberta and Saskatchewan?
Sorry, go ahead, Noah.
Well, I just wanted to say 2 quick things. First of all, I think all of us seem to agree on about 90% of this, and we're mainly just nitpicking, but in the spirit of that, on the Canada example, I think Jessica brings up a good point about companies and their willingness to invest, based on sort of long-term expectations. To me, I just wonder if that's one of these examples where we're sort of blaming the carbon price for the problems of climate policy. And really what the expectations are is whether Canada is going to be on a net zero by 2050 pathway, the way the government says that they are, or, if the Trudeau government loses, better than me, but my guess is that it's not just the carbon price that's going away, it's that pathway that's going away. So I'm fine with with opinions that carbon prices should be lower and regulations should be higher. It's just not obvious to me that that's an easier political battle. The one other point I wanted to make was just to, Danny and David have both made the point about marginal cost as sort of a proxy for ambition. And that just makes me very uncomfortable. Like, I get that there's a correlation there, but to me, high marginal costs or to point to high marginal costs, that could just be an ineffective, expensive program that's also weak that you're looking at. And in particular, with the California example, you have LCF prices, which not only are very high, but they are correlate. They are the price of the cap and trade program is dependent on the price of the low carbon fuel standard. So I just think I think it's not an apples to apples comparison to compare ambition that way. Like if you look at
that was sorry. Go ahead. No, I don't want.
I was just going to finish the point by saying if you look at the California transportation sector, you guys know California better than me. My sense is that the low carbon fuel standard, it's doing some great things, especially internationally, but I don't think it's succeeding at decarbonizing California's transportation sector, just like the cap and trade program isn't. So I'm just not sure 10 times the ambition is the way I would look at it. That's all.
Yeah, I was wondering about that too, because there's interaction between the different policies. So if you have an economy-wide cap and then you force reductions into certain sectors through sector-based policies, that'll have an impact on the overall economy-wide price, but doesn't necessarily indicate that one is much less effective. than the other. But the question I had, Danny, was about one of the one of the issues you and David raised was about the use of the revenue. We don't necessarily know how to spend money well. So two questions. One, I mean, that would be true if you kind of shifted away from that. If we have an approach that's based on investment, which is a centerpiece of President-elect Biden's approach, for example, you know, the question is, do we know how to spend money really well in a cost-effective way to drive decarbonization? And again, is that a function of the source of revenue, a carbon tax, or is that just a challenge with spending? And then I was curious about the durability of different policies. And this came up in the Canada example as well. I'm trying to now weave some themes in the questions. There are too many questions to read all of them, but I see some common themes among them. And one is questions about the dividends approach and to what extent use of revenue from a carbon tax to provide a sustainable and predictable source of dividends to people actually creates some political durability for a policy because people don't want to lose that expected dividend. Is that an argument for carbon pricing, you think?
So let me take both of those really quickly. Maybe the first point about sort of how do we measure ambition and how do we know and how effective are public spending? I'm going to lump that all into we don't really have good information on most of it. And I want to embrace this because the data are awful. There's almost no serious studies. And to be perfectly honest, many of my colleagues in the economics discipline are studying this stuff without understanding what's actually going on the ground. So we really need to do a much better job. And I think one of the most profound implications of our book is that we need to study the reality of all of these instruments with all of their warts and flaws to better answer the questions you've brought up, because we're not doing a great job. And if our argument is correct, markets will not automatically solve that problem for us. And we're going to need to have much more of a discussion and steered strategic conversation that's based on good analysis and data. That conversation applies to the spending side, where I think the opacity of how spending occurs in these climate programs is above and beyond what you often see in public finance situations where it's hard enough. We had, well, I won't get into the examples. It's a mess, and I'm not suggesting it's fundamentally different from the challenge of effective public spending, but because it's wrapped in a green halo, I think we do have additional games getting played on that side, and we need to take that stuff really seriously. With respect to your durability point, you know, I think this is a big challenge. And when I look at the Canadian proposal, for example, extremely high prices. And I just want to say briefly to my friends on the left, if Canada gets anywhere near that, it's an unambiguous success and everyone should celebrate that. The question is, what's it going to look like to get there? And the two big questions that I think one is posited and the other's unanswered. How are you going to deal with impacts in the industrial sector and to trade? And the Canadian proposal, like most ambitious carbon pricing proposals, says border adjustments and just says it. And that's kind of where we are. That's a much harder problem to solve, and no one's yet solved it. On the transportation fuels impact side, which is, I think, where most of the consumer sensitivity comes, the Canadian answer is revenue recycling. And Jason, as you've suggested, people have been making the arguments largely based on the Alaska Oil Fund and a couple of other state funds that when you create essentially a kind of entitlement that people are aware of and they care about, they want to hang on to it. And I think the big question is, will anyone relate to carbon prices that way? And the honest answer is we don't know. There's some early political science evidence that suggests people don't know and don't care up in Canada so far. I guarantee you nobody knows what's going on with revenues recycling in California, even though we have an on-bill utility credit. Nobody knows anything about it. It's buried in your utility bill. Can it happen? I don't think we know. The argument we make in the book is that you need to basically spend a huge fraction of your revenues if you want to use these recycling mechanisms to create those political constituencies. And that's a different mode of revenue use that addresses the political problem. And I think Canada will be testing this particular phenomenon. Again, if they succeed, unambiguous positive gains for the world and perhaps a new model of what's politically resilient, but it's something I think that flows directly from the analytical structure in our book. And you can see that as all consistent, whether it fails or succeeds, because it's basically targeting that entire effort on voter perception of what the carbon price will do. And if they succeed, great.
Jess, am I right that Canada also has an output-based rebate program for industrial sources so that there is some compensation even absent a border adjustment?
Yeah, so essentially what happens now is, right, the industrial emitters have this output-based system, which is basically benchmark against industry standards. So to kind of protect a little bit against international competition. And so it's not, my understanding is that that system would stay in place until whatever border carbon adjustment thing happens, but that really hasn't been elaborated. And honestly, I think it depends a lot on the Biden administration, right? Because if they go forward with this, then we have no choice, because that's where, I mean, the US is our market, 98% or 99%. So I think that, we will go along with the status quo until probably forced to do so. That's my impression, but I don't have any data to back that up.
A couple of questions coming in about you raised, Danny and David, several concerns with how a carbon tax would be designed. And one of the concerns that has been raised, and increasingly in recent weeks and months, is around issues of equity and environmental justice in how market mechanisms are used. And I was wondering if you could comment on that, and whether you think the alternatives are far more manageable in terms of how to address concerns that environmental harms and pollution can be concentrated in certain communities, or the cost of policy can fall disproportionately on certain communities with a carbon price. Is that not true for the alternatives you see?
David, shall I start, or do you want to take a crack at that?
Why don't you start, and then I want to talk a little bit about what we know and what we don't know about the design of politically durable mechanisms.
That'd be great. So, I mean, this discussion around, for example, hotspots and pollution hotspots under cap and trade is a very old discussion that's pitted proponents of market-based efficiency against the concerns of communities living under disproportionate pollution burdens. And I think a lot of the discussion I hear, including like right now, is fighting an old fight about that. And I think is actually missing the practical political picture. When you look at the experience of environmental justice communities in places like California, for 15 years, we've been almost exclusively focused on market-based policies. And the result of that effort in California has been a $17 price on carbon, with major regulatory rollbacks that not only frustrated the state regulators' ability to address oil and gas emissions at the midstream and upstream levels, which is now legally prohibited as a result of a deal to extend carbon pricing, but it also blocked local air districts, the local air pollution regulators who in our state manage stationary sources. And in the case of the Bay Area, community groups have been working for years to stop the expansion of refineries in low-income communities of color. And those multi-year efforts were also rolled back legally as part of the deal to extend the program. When you look at the program in California, it's almost all offsets. The volume of offsets in the program is likely greater than the counterfactual emission reductions expected through 2020. When you add this all up, the practical experience on the ground, if you're a representative of communities of color, is that no one has talked about your issues. They've all talked about climate summits, and you have a program with offsets that doesn't control the pollution sources in front of you. Now, realistically, all of us know a price on carbon is better than nothing at all. And I spend a lot of time talking to my friends in the environmental justice community, trying to build that common ground. The practical response they give me is, why is nobody focusing on my issues? And I don't have an answer to that question, because we spend all of our time talking about a $17 price, which is not transformative and will not be transformative. As a component of a broader strategy, perhaps really, really important. But I think when you get down to the EJ issues, the question is anyone actually focusing on the air quality disparities? And do the political deals that get made with large, particularly stationary source emitters, basically frustrate the potential to target them in the direct ways that people who are worried about toxics and air pollution and criteria pollution in their local communities care about? And for the most part, those conversations don't interact. And that sense of being shut out and excluded, I think, is a huge part of where the difference in perception comes from. It is not a question of, will the sulfur trading program in the 1990s lead to pollution hotspots and concentrate and increase pollution? I think that's largely a canard. I think it's a question of where the attention goes, because we're clearly not making very much progress on these air quality issues in the most polluted parts of the state or the country.
Thank you.
I agree with that.
David.
Just very briefly, I think the center and the center-right parts of the American political spectrum that don't internalize, comes from somebody who sits in the center, sometimes to his peril, don't appreciate the extent to which these concerns that Danny's just articulated, and are often travel under the heading of EJ or other headings, have become well-articulated, organized, politically very powerful and need to be taken on board seriously. And the feeling that they haven't been taken on board is now manifest in lots of political actions, some of which we see on a daily basis. I guess the point I want to make is that for those of you watching at home who study political economy, and if you're looking for something to work on that's highly applied and extremely important, it would be to understand the trade-offs involved in politically viable carbon actions. And Noah's comments point to this, Jess's comments point to this, and I think it's a toolkit. And the dividend is one of the conspicuous tools that people talk about, but it comes at a massive political cost because you spend all the money on the dividend. And it's not clear that you get what you spend for, what you're spending for. The reason that I'm so attracted to the plastic industrial politics is that when the industrial organization changes and you have more firms that favor decarbonization, that contributes massively to the political stability of your policy strategy. And so there's all these different ways to, in effect, reshape the political landscape. And we ought to understand the trade-offs involved in those, give them a real empirical test as opposed to imaginary empirical tests. And that's one of the most important frontier topics, I think.
I'm wondering if you could I think I mentioned this in passing earlier, but come back to this question of the preferred policy pathway and how fundamentally different or how much overlap there may be with things that many environmental economists and others find appealing about market-based approaches, not just a carbon tax, but things that allow some flexibility because we don't know exactly what the cheapest way is going to be to reduce emissions. So clearly, when you say industrial policy, there's an emphasis, or important emphasis in the book on investment in new technology. We know in say in electricity, a carbon price, and you talk about this in the book, can do a lot, in part because we have a lot of the solutions sitting there before us. That is not necessarily true for cement and steel and jet fuel and other things where we need to invest in new technology with government support, maybe with targeting particular technologies we think are promising. And then you would have, I hear you saying the ability to set emission reduction limits or some other type of standard is going to be politically easier sector by sector. But the way in which you would build that coalition in effect would lead to a place where you would have some sort of standard, and then how you implement that, how you design that policy could allow a decent amount of flexibility for trading within that sector. And you start to get something that looks kind of like a sectoral cap and trade system with big investments in innovation and technology. And that doesn't sound hugely different. It's a somewhat different approach, but doesn't sound hugely different. It still recognizes a lot of the benefits of market-based approaches. I'm wondering, is that sort of how you see where things need to move going forward?
I think there's an enormous amount of overlap between the sector-specific approach we describe in the book and flexible, tradable performance standards. I mean, I think all the words kind of melt into the same jumble in the middle. So I see a lot of commonality there. One, I think, important nuance that I want to distinguish here is the predictability of those systems for investment is something you need to take into account really seriously. And I'll give you another example using the low carbon fuel standard, which, again, whatever small volume it might be contributing is $200 a ton right now. And there's a lot you can do at $200 a ton. But if you needed to risk capital investment on the scale of $500 million or $1 billion, and you were doing it on the basis of the price developed by essentially a cap and trade program, which is what the low carbon fuel standard is, you don't know where that price is going to be in 3 or in 5 years. So it's actually extraordinarily difficult to create stable investment expectations with pure market-based systems, even when they're targeted very narrowly in a sector, and even where the politics permit high marginal prices, as they do in this example. So I think we do see a broad range of comparability across all this stuff. But when you think about what it takes to get somebody to invest a large amount of capital on the basis of an uncertain market-based pricing system that's dependent 100% on politics, I think we need to be really thoughtful about the differences between procurement mandates and tradable performance standards and minimum prices and maximum prices. You have to very carefully thread some needles to give everybody the confidence they need to get it done. And I think that's left out of these discussions a lot.
I agree with that completely. By the way, Jason, you've articulated it very well, so we should have added you to the masthead of our book. I will say one other thing, which is credibility really matters. for these longer term investments. And so I think our view probably overweights compared with the kind of optimal, more market oriented, or let me remove the word optimal from that, from the more market oriented approach. Our approach probably overweights investments in innovation and in effect pushing the technological frontier because it helps alter the political landscape. The other thing in the United States in particular is we probably would rely more on the states than would be certainly optimal from a pure design perspective because of this issue of credibility. And I think this is an area where the Biden administration is going to have to look at who the median voter really is in the Senate, regardless of who controls the Senate. Because if you don't have the capacity to do legislation that's stickier, then you want to be able to signal to industry inside the US and to the rest of the world credibility of American policy. And that's going to require pushing more out to the states, more into the financial markets, frankly, where small changes can have result in big changes in direction of travel that are hard to reverse. And we really just have to evaluate all this in terms of credibility of the overall direction.
Great. Jessica or Noah, did you want to come in on that, or we'll pull in a couple other questions? Okay. But just so I want to make sure I understand kind of your view, because there we found maybe some commonality in what is beneficial about the way different policies are designed and brought into your approach. I'm going to read you one sentence caught me in your book. Efforts spent tilting at ephemeral magical policy solutions waste scarce resources that should instead be invested in things that work. So the question for you is whether you think carbon pricing alone is of course insufficient, but your claim seems to be stronger, that actually pushing for carbon pricing is actually harmful to the cause. So can you talk just a little bit about that?
So, I mean, any day you work Don Quixote into casual conversations, a good day. So that's part of the logic behind the sentence. I think our point is that you're not going to lead with the transformation using the markets. The idea that the markets, and this is an area I'm sure where we, all of my friends and colleagues in environmental economics are going to hit the bolt of econ lightning for saying this, but the assumption that the markets are going to send even a credible signal about the degree of change needed when you're seeing so much of the world having zero pricing or, kind of faux pricing, Potemkin pricing. The more firms think about this problem as a marginal compliance problem at $10 a ton, the more they shop it out to the CSR group that does a glossy report, and they make a few changes at the margins, ideally by buying a garbage offset, and they don't make transformative changes. And the whole problem of ambition, and let's just set aside 1.5, the whole problem of ambition is almost everywhere. It's about it's about the search for transformative solutions and then starting to invest around those such that the markets then transform both politics and technology. And that's the core logic. And that's a problem of joint industrial strategy as opposed to a problem of marginal compliance at $10 a ton.
I'll also add, I mean, we are not actually opposed to carbon pricing. I think we try throughout the book, and that sentence is not a great example, but to emphasize it's part of a broader portfolio. It's good. The whole book is written from the perspective, if you could do it, it would be desirable. And the argument is that it won't work the way it's been pursued. The windmill we don't want people to tilt at is this idea that 1,000 different carbon markets are going to cover the entire economy of their subnational jurisdiction and link together, and that is the process over the next 10 or 20 years by which we get to global coordinated climate action. I do think that's a farce, and I think that's an idea that many have been pursuing in good faith in most cases for a long time. And the suggestion that that's the opposite way, the wrong way to look at the world, is not an argument that carbon pricing is bad or shouldn't be pursued where the politics align and where the conditions are right. But the point of the book is to say, how would you start to think about when those conditions are right in a structural way and not just more of an ideological way? Again, taking as a premise where you can get it done, it's a good thing.
There are a couple of questions. Sorry, go ahead, Noah.
Well, I mean, I think Danny and David are right, but just because I think I'm sort of the carbon pricing shill of the group, I just want to make sure to throw the point out there that, we've been focusing on the political difficulties of carbon pricing, which I think are accurate, but there's also political advantages of carbon pricing. And, like we have groups in this country, like, you have the Citizens Climate Lobby, which has hundreds of thousands of volunteers and tens of thousands of people who descend on Congress every year to lobby for this policy mechanism. And I just don't want to, I don't want us to ignore that I just don't see that happening for a low carbon fuel standard. So I think it's like any policy mechanism. You have advantages and disadvantages, and it's going to work in some places and not in others.
There are a couple of questions that I think have the broad theme of something along the lines of you're explaining why, from a political economy standpoint, certain alternatives to a carbon tax, standards and investment may be easier to get done or build support for. Question, and Noah raised this earlier, sort of what the abatement cost is, right? I mean, the abatement cost. The reason many people like a theorized economy-wide approach is because you find the lowest and cheapest reductions, right? So when you substitute a regulatory toolkit for that, if that is not well designed, it potentially has higher per ton abatement costs than an idealized cap and trade or carbon tax approach. And so that may not be an issue for modest emission reductions, but as you get deeper and deeper emission reductions, is there a political economy concern about the cost to people, whether they see that cost directly on the fuel, in the 3-foot high signs at the gas station or indirectly? Do you worry about the ultimate aggregate cost of achieving a certain emission reduction goal if policies that are more politically feasible maybe aren't as cost effective?
Yes, and again, the rallying cry I want everybody to take up is we're not doing a good job asking those questions anywhere at all right now, and they need to be front and center all of the time. If our argument is correct, markets will not be in a place to do that automatically. And that is a virtue if they did exist in the way that theory prefers, because you wouldn't have to worry about this problem. Our view is that you do have to worry about this problem. And that means we need really serious research. And I just want to point this out. There's almost no good empirical research on the carbon pricing programs that are out there. And there's often less research on the regulations that we believe are doing most of the work. That opacity and lack of information that is grounded not in theoretical modeling studies, but in practical, hard-nosed experiences is exactly the literature that needs to be developed to inform a conversation that unfortunately is, or for better or worse, depending on your point of view, going to need to be executed by the state and by the academic community if markets don't do it automatically. Our argument is that markets will not. And therefore, you need to have a much richer understanding of what works, what doesn't, at what cost, and to make that less of an ideological argument and more of an empirical one, because it won't happen automatically.
Can I jump here?
We're just about out of time, but I wanted to give Jessica and Noah a final comment, and then Danny or David, if you have one, and then we'll wrap up. Please, Jessica.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in on this because, first of all, I completely agree with Danny, and I have the receipts on this. Like, we just don't have the information, and we don't have, aside from that great slide that he put up, we don't have good sense of how carbon pricing stacks up to other policies. So that, I think that's really important. I would also just put in a plea here to think about, I think that this, how much will it cost, or can we do it more cheaply or efficiently, is just a red herring, right? It's a red herring for two reasons. One is the costs of unabated climate change are going to be much, much bigger than anything we can possibly imagine. And secondly, they are going to hurt the people who have who are least responsible for causing this problem. So the arguments for efficiency are really, in some ways, I won't say immoral, but at least amoral arguments about who is expendable when climate change, as climate change progresses. So I think the question is not how can we do this most cheaply? The question is how can we just do this? So
yeah, the cost of inaction is probably higher than the cost of action, whatever that action looks like. Noah.
Well, there's no doubt that's true. And I want to say, I agree that we need to be doing way more of these exposed studies. I think I would blame us less for that, maybe, only because I think the point about our lack of ambition so far really matters here. It's almost like it's March during the pandemic, and we're trying to figure out all the science of this when there just hasn't been that much action yet. And I think what the great thing now about countries moving forward and putting in place policies and pledges and all that is that it creates just a wealth of opportunities for people like us to actually dig in on how well they're working.
Thanks. David or Danny, do you have a final comment?
Yeah, I just want to say three things quickly. One is I want to push back a little bit on economic efficiency. I think it does matter, but to just channel Jess here, the prior is that we need much more serious action. I think the essence of the argument in the book is that political economy is a necessary prior condition. It conditions what is feasible to do. And we've had a kind of a wrong mindset about what's feasible to do and how it's designed and so on. And as a result of that, we've been making economic efficiency arguments, which of course are important, but through the lens of a set of policy instrument choices that aren't as practical as we might have originally thought from theoretical perspective. And so that's the first thing I want to say. Second thing is, I think the good news, to pick up where Noah left, which I think is exactly right. The good news is the ambition prior to the pandemic, the ambition was swinging up. After the pandemic, people are focused on a lot of other things, understandably, but ambition is still swinging up. And so we're in a world now where this kind of debate about how to design the policy instruments really, really matters, because we're setting conditions that are going to guide direction of travel, and which governments are credible on this and which aren't. It's a giant test of government, in effect, just like the pandemic was. Not all governments did well. And the last thing I'll say is a word of thanks to you for hosting, and the Center for hosting, because it's really our pleasure to have a chance to talk about these ideas, and no place better than doing it with this great panel. Great.
Well, thanks to both of you for being with us, and thanks to all of you for watching. Thanks, Jessica and Noah, for the reactions and comments. Appreciate the audience tuning in. As we mentioned, the full video recording of this event will be available on our website in a few days. It really was a pleasure to read the book. Really interesting, very thought-provoking. And so, David and Danny, congratulations. I hope everyone will pick up a copy and enjoy it over the holidays. And in that regard, this will be our final public program for the calendar year. We'll resume our public event schedule at the Center on Global Energy Policy in January. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. And throughout all of 2020, for a full calendar of upcoming events, visit us online. Wish you all a happy holidays and a happy new year, and we look forward to seeing you all next year. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.